Hello everybody and welcome to this. It's another video in the series on Animal Farm. Everything I go through is taken from Mr. Bruff's Guide to Animal Farm, written by Kerry Lewis, edited by me, available in paperback on Amazon, Kindle form on Amazon, ebook at mrbruff.com. So today I want to talk to you about structure, and we're going to look at the structure to begin with in terms of Freytag's pyramid. You'll be familiar with Freytag's pyramid if you've watched many of my other videos. Gustav Freytag was a 19th century German novelist who recognized common patterns in the plots of plays and stories and then developed a diagram to analyze them. So the structure of Animal Farm can be analysed using this pyramid, and there are two different ways of analysing the text depending on what you see as the climax. So you might want to discuss this in class. It's quite interesting to think about what is the climax of the novel. The first interpretation we'll look at is if the climax is Napoleon's choice to seize power in chapter 5. So we begin with the exposition, and obviously this is in chronological order from left to right. So the exposition is the first part of a plot in which the reader learns about the characters and the setting. So in chapters 1 and 2 we meet the main characters, that's the human Mr. Jones, and the animals including Napoleon, Snowball, Squealer, Major and Boxer. We're introduced to the setting of the farm, and we learn that the animals' thoughts and feelings, particularly in response to the farmer, are not positive. We learn about old Major's philosophy of animalism. Then we have the inciting incident, sometimes called the complication. And this is where something happens that begins the action or the conflict. It's something that happens that gets the ball rolling for the eventual build-up to the climax. And we can see the inciting incident in Animal Farm as being the moment in chapter 2 where the drunken Mr. Jones forgets to feed the animals, which of course is the moment that triggers the rebellion. The rising action is other events that build up towards the climax, so the story becoming more exciting as conflicts build. And in Animal Farm, we see the rebellion is successful, the animals drive the humans off the farm, the animals establish a new society based on the principles of animalism, and the pigs, being the most intelligent animals, take charge. Excitement builds with the Battle of the Cowshed, and it builds still further with Napoleon and Snowball's quarrel about the windmill. Then we have the climax. So the climax is the point of greatest tension in a text. The main character comes face to face with a conflict and has a choice to make. And in chapter 5, Napoleon chooses to set his dogs on Snowball, who now flees the farm. Remember, there are different ways of interpreting what the climax is. You decide yourself. The greatest moment of conflict and tension where the main character has a choice to make. What would you think it is? In the falling action, that's the aftermath of the climax. In this case, the consequences of Napoleon's leadership as he asserts his power and consolidates his position, ably assisted by Squealer's propaganda. Napoleon instructs the animals to build the windmill, so their workload increases and they have less food, and Napoleon forges trade alliances with other farmers. He moves to the farmhouse, he spreads propaganda against Snowball when the windmill is destroyed in a storm. He starves the hens to death, forces confessions, and orders executions. Under Napoleon's orders, Minimus teaches the animals a song to replace the banned beasts of England, and the animals are encouraged to view Napoleon as a cult figure through Minimus's poem. Napoleon's trade agreements with Frederick result in the Battle of the Windmill and its subsequent rebuild, and the pigs become fatter at the expense of the hungry animals. Animal Farm is proclaimed a republic and Napoleon its president. Napoleon is now effectively a dictator, and Moses returns to the farm and his religious message makes life under the dictatorship more bearable for some. Napoleon orders the retirement land to be ploughed and used for crops, so the dying and now useless Boxer is taken away by the knacker. The resolution would be the sort of settling of the main problem or conflict, and that could be at the end of chapter 9, where the animals believe everything that they're told and the pig's power is now absolute, and the denouement, the fallout in which any leftover questions, mysteries or secrets are solved. In the final chapter we see that not one of the original 7 commandments remains, hardly anyone remembers life from before the rebellion, and the pigs now have the same status as humans. The animals are still slaves, just as they were before the rebellion. They are, in fact, worse off because, blinded by propaganda, it does not occur to them to question those in authority. You can also interpret the text as having the climax being Boxer's death in chapter 9, and in that sense, the exposition and inciting incident would be the same as what we've just looked at, but the rising action would be things like the animals driving humans off the farm, the animals establishing a new society and taking charge, the Battle of the Cowshed, etc., etc. And in that interpretation, then, we would see the climax as the aging and dying Boxer taken away by the knacker. It doesn't really matter which one you use. There's a strong case for both. The key question to consider when analysing the structure of the novella is, what is the novella about? It's about Napoleon as an allegorical representation of Stalin and his rise to power. Or is it about the fate of Boxer, who represents the exploited workers of the regime? Orwell attacks the Soviet regime by highlighting its hypocrisy, so Boxer's death as the climax would hope to focus the reader on the plight of the Soviet workers and the failure of communist ideology. However, he also wants to explore how it's possible for such a regime to gain power in the first place, and if that was his primary aim, Napoleon driving Snowball away would better fit the climax. The falling action, which includes Boxer's death, would subsequently serve to focus the attention of the reader on the consequences of Napoleon's absolute power. The reader is therefore invited to consider the nature of a society that allows dictators to rise to power. Now, the whole text has a chronological structure, and there's a gap of an unspecified number of years between the end of chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10. And at the end of the resolution in chapter 9, the pig's power is absolute. And Orwell's manipulation of time in chapter 10 allows the reader to see how years later the pigs have consolidated their power. And this puts the reader in a better position to critically evaluate and compare the rise of animalism to communism. The fact that by chapter 10 much time has passed makes explicit to the reader how little understanding the animals have of their own history. It's at this point that the reader fully appreciates the power of propaganda to brainwash the animals. The only exception is Benjamin, sorry about my Microsoft updates, who cynically states that things never change. Ironically, this heightens the tragedy because he could have chosen to involve himself and challenge those in power. So in terms of the chronology of the structure, yes, it's told in chronological order, but there is a gap of time between the end of chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10. And of course, why have that gap? Well, it allows the reader to evaluate, how has everything gone? How did this end up in, by the final stages of the text? As well as being chronological, the novella might be considered cyclical because, in a sense, it begins where it ends, with a drunken, irresponsible ruler who lives in the farmhouse. To leave no doubt in the reader's mind about Orwell's intentions, the watching animals cannot distinguish the pigs from the humans, and Orwell illustrated in this final action his complete cynicism about totalitarianism. He was disillusioned by communist ideology, having seen in Spain that it does not, and seemingly cannot, work in practice. Communism, he believed, could not work and did not improve life for the poor, and this is because it failed to consider the all-too human greed for power. Interestingly, recent historians have debated the fact that communist leaders like Stalin were in fact red Tsars. Finally then, foreshadowing. Orwell employs the structural device of foreshadowing to create a sense of inevitability that the communist regime is doomed to fail. Old Major states, "The life of an animal is misery and slavery." And this foreshadows and prepares us for the conditions the animals later endure after the revolution. Likewise, he states, man is the only creature that consumes without producing, which foreshadows the pigs stealing the milk and apples, culminating in their luxurious lifestyles when they sleep in the farmhouse on beds, wear clothes, and lead a life of privilege. Old Major's reference to the knacker in his speech foreshadows Boxer being taken away by the knacker Alfred Simmons in chapter 9. There are many other examples of foreshadowing in the novella, and by using this device, Orwell encourages the reader to reflect upon the political process of apparent change. He invites the reader to consider that communism as a political theory does not work, because everything seems to be fated to happen and does happen as it seems to be foreshadowed. If you found this video useful, including the quick Microsoft update alert, then give it a thumbs up if you'd like more Animal Farm videos.